So this, if it were true, and it is true, would put the Sphinx back to a much earlier period, which would tie in with Schwaller's work and John Anthony West's subsequent work, that there were indications that dynastic Egypt as we know it, going back to about 3000 BC, was really a legacy of what I call now an earlier cycle of civilization.
Robert M. Schoch, a geologist with a PhD from Yale University, came up with a fascinating idea in the 1990s about the age of the Great Sphinx of Giza. He noticed something interesting about the erosion patterns on the Sphinx and the surrounding area. Unlike the typical wind and sand erosion you'd expect in Egypt's deserts, these patterns looked more like they were caused by water. This was a big deal because it suggested that the Sphinx might be much older than we thought. Now, Graham Hancock, a well-known British author who loves digging into ancient mysteries, found Schoch's theory really interesting and started supporting it.
Since the early 1990s, question marks have been raised over the age of the Great Sphinx of Giza in Egypt. Egyptologists think it's about 4,500 years old, although there's not a shred of inscription evidence to support this date. Independent researcher John Anthony West and Robert Schoch, professor of geology at Boston University, have made a case that the Sphinx must be much older than that.
Hancock is known for questioning the usual stories we hear about historical and archaeological sites. Schoch's theory caught his eye because it suggested that the Sphinx was around during a time when Egypt had a lot of rain, which was way back around 8,000 to 10,000 BCE. This idea of heavy rainfall leading to the erosion we see on the Sphinx today is really cool, but also quite controversial. You see, traditionally, archaeologists have dated the Sphinx to around 2500 BCE, during Pharaoh Khafre's time. They base this on where the Sphinx is located in the Giza pyramid complex and how it looks compared to other stuff from that period. But if Schoch is right and the Sphinx was actually built when it was much wetter in Egypt, then it could be thousands of years older than we thought, maybe even dating back to the Neolithic era. That's a pretty big shakeup in how we think about ancient Egyptian history.
To put it bluntly, the Sphinx did not originate with Khafre in the 4th dynasty, and really the beginning of my serious work and career looking at ancient civilizations.
Instead of the typical wear and tear you'd expect from wind and sand in a desert, the Sphinx had features like deep cracks, wavy lines on its limestone walls, and smooth, rounded edges. These are the kinds of things you usually see with water erosion, not wind or sand. Now, the Sphinx is made out of limestone, which is pretty easy for water to wear down. And what's interesting is that this limestone is made up of different layers, some harder than others. Schoch saw that the water erosion affected these layers in a way that you wouldn't really see if it was just wind and sand doing the damage. But here's where it gets even more intriguing. Schoch looked at the climate history of the Sahara Desert and the Giza area and found out that way back between 10,000 and 5,000 BCE, this place wasn't the dry desert we know today. It was actually pretty wet, thanks to something called the Neolithic subpluvial phase.
We know there were hyper-arid Sahara conditions on the Giza Plateau for the last 5,000 or so years. And this ties in with the origins of civilization, according to the standard story, which is that civilization began between 4,000 and 3,000 BCE.
This was a time when there was a lot more rain. So Schoch thinks that this rainy period might have caused the kind of water erosion we see on the Sphinx, suggesting it's much older than we thought, maybe even dating back to these wetter times. This goes against the usual dating of the Sphinx to around 2500 BCE during Pharaoh Khafre's reign, based on its style and where it's located in the Giza pyramid complex. Schoch's idea definitely shakes things up in terms of how we think about the Sphinx's age. So Robert Schoch didn't just look at the Sphinx in isolation when he was thinking about this whole water erosion idea. He actually compared the wear and tear on the Sphinx with other ancient limestone sites that had been exposed to a lot of rain. This was his way of checking if what he saw on the Sphinx matched up with known patterns of water erosion elsewhere. It's like looking at different worn-out jeans to figure out if they got ripped from climbing trees or just from washing them a lot. He found sites with a clear historical background where they knew for sure that rain had done its thing over the years. When he looked at these places, he noticed that the erosion patterns were quite similar to what he was seeing on the Sphinx. This kind of bolstered his argument that the erosion on the Sphinx could really be from water, not just wind or sand.
You look at the evidence, and that's really where I was coming from. But my point is that even in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when I first got involved with this, if I looked at it critically, the evidence was not that definitive for the age of the Sphinx.
Schock's approach was pretty comprehensive. He wasn't just a geologist looking at rocks. He was also considering the weather patterns from thousands of years ago and what archaeologists were saying about these ancient sites. It's like he was piecing together a big jigsaw puzzle from different fields of study. But of course, there are always different sides to a story. Some critics pointed out that the erosion could be due to other natural processes unique to the Giza area, like fluctuations in groundwater, or the way certain chemicals in the air might wear down the rock. And then there's the whole thing about what archaeologists have found around the Sphinx, like artifacts and writings that suggest it was built around 2500 BCE, during Pharaoh Khafre's time. This kind of goes against Schock's idea that the Sphinx is way older because of the water erosion. So it's a bit of a puzzle with some pieces still missing. Graham Hancock has this really intriguing idea about an ancient civilization that he thinks existed way before the ones we usually learn about in history books, like the Egyptians, Sumerians, and the Indus Valley folks. He reckons this civilization was around many millennia earlier, and that it might have been wiped out by a huge comet impact around 10,000 BCE. Imagine that a whole advanced society just gone in the blink of an eye, leaving only bits and pieces behind. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Hancock thinks this civilization wasn't just hanging out in one spot, it was all over the place, having a global influence. He suggests that after whatever disaster hit them, the survivors might have traveled far and wide, sharing their knowledge and helping kickstart other ancient cultures. Hancock dives into myths and oral traditions from all over the world too. He's not just dismissing these stories as old wives' tales, but considering them as potential historical records. For example, he's really interested in the flood myths that pop up in different cultures. He thinks these might be a collective memory of a real event that had a huge impact on this lost civilization.
The best explanation is that floods of icy meltwater released by the heat and kinetic energy of the impacts flowed off the North American ice cap and into the Atlantic Ocean, where they interrupted the Gulf Stream, a key element of the central heating system of our planet, hence the sudden and dramatic cooling.
Now, Hancock is big on astronomy. He points to how some ancient structures, like the Giza pyramids and the Sphinx, line up with certain stars and constellations. He thinks this isn't just a coincidence, but a sign of advanced astronomical knowledge. He's also into the idea that these ancient folks understood the precession of the equinoxes. That's a fancy term for a slow shift in Earth's rotation over a 26,000-year cycle. If he's right, it means they were way ahead of their time in understanding the cosmos. Graham Hancock has this captivating theory about ancient civilizations and their architectural wonders. He's really into how these old structures, like the pyramids in Egypt, Stonehenge, and those incredible megalithic sites in South America, show off some serious engineering and architectural skills. Hancock reckons that to build these things with such precision and detail, those ancient folks must have had some advanced knowledge and technology that we don't usually give them credit for. Take, for instance, the way the stones are cut at Pumapunku in Bolivia. Hancock points out that the cuts are so precise, it's as if they had access to some really advanced tools. And when it comes to building massive structures, he's all about the techniques they must have used. He's amazed at how accurately these huge stones were fitted together, often without any mortar, and wonders how on earth they moved and positioned stones that weigh several tons. This isn't just your everyday heavy lifting. We're talking about some serious know-how in engineering and possibly some clever uses of leverage and pulley systems. Now, he doesn't stop there. He's also fascinated by the mathematical and geometrical knowledge that these structures reveal. He talks about the use of the golden ratio, pi, and precise angular measurements, which shows a sophisticated understanding of math and geometry. Like, take the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Its alignment, the way its base is perfectly level, and the precise angles of its sides. Hancock sees this as evidence of a much more advanced understanding of geometry and engineering than we might think. Then there are the monumental buildings in Mesoamerica, such as the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan and the Mayan pyramids. Hancock highlights their architectural sophistication, urban planning, and the use of large stone blocks. All of this, to him, points to a level of technological proficiency and knowledge that goes way beyond what we've traditionally thought was possible for these ancient cultures. In a nutshell, Hancock is looking at these ancient structures and saying, hey, there's more to the story here. He's suggesting that these civilizations had a depth of knowledge and skill in construction, engineering, and mathematics that challenges our conventional understanding of ancient history.
It wasn't something the Maya made up. The Olmecs used that same symbolism. So the Mayan calendar is actually an Olmec calendar. And if we then consider the possibility that the Olmecs may just be the latest, the earliest surviving manifestation of that calendar, it could go back.
Then there's Teotihuacan in Mexico. Hancock looks at the layout of this ancient city and sees a kind of mirror image of our solar system's planetary orbits. To him, this suggests that the people who built Teotihuacan had a pretty detailed knowledge of astronomy and space. Stonehenge in England is another example. Hancock thinks it was used as an astronomical observatory because of how it aligns with the solstices. He sees this as further evidence that ancient people understood celestial movements really well. And let's not forget about the pyramid of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza. During the equinoxes, this pyramid casts a shadow that looks like a serpent. Hancock sees this as a sophisticated way of tracking the sun's path, again showing an advanced understanding of astronomy. Hancock also dives into the idea of precession, which is this slow wobble in Earth's rotation that takes about 26,000 years to go full circle. He looks at how the Giza pyramids align with Orion's belt, and how the Sphinx lines up with the Leo constellation during what's known as the Age of Leo, around 10,500 BCE. He thinks these alignments aren't random but deliberate, showing that the people back then understood this complex astronomical phenomenon. So, in a nutshell, Hancock is really into the idea that ancient structures around the world weren't just built for the heck of it. He believes they were deliberately aligned with stars, constellations, and celestial events, showing that ancient civilizations had a much deeper understanding of astronomy than we usually give them credit for.